The Dogs and the Fox. Some dogs found the skin of a lion and furiously began to tear at it with their teeth. A fox chanced to see them and laughed scornfully.
"If that lion had been alive,"
he said,
"it would have been a very different story. He would have made you feel how much sharper his claws are than your teeth."
"It is easy, and also contemptible, to kick a man that is down." The Dogs and the Hides. Some hungry dogs saw a number of hides at the bottom of a stream where the tanner had put them to soak. A fine hide makes an excellent meal for a hungry dog, but the water was deep, and the dogs could not reach the hides from the bank. So they held a council and decided that the very best thing to do was to drink up the river. All fell to lapping up the water as fast as they could. But though they drank and drank until one after another all of them had burst with drinking, still, for all their effort, the water in the river remained as high as ever. Do not try to do impossible things. The Rabbit, the Weasel, and the Cat. A rabbit left his home one day for a dinner of clover, but he forgot to latch the door of his house, and while he was gone, a weasel walked in and calmly made himself at home. When the rabbit returned, there was the weasel's nose sticking out of the rabbit's own doorway, sniffing the fine air. The rabbit was quite angry, for a rabbit, and requested the weasel to move out. But the weasel was perfectly content. He was settled down for good. A wise old cat heard the dispute and offered to settle it.
"Come close to me,"
said the cat.
"I am very deaf. Put your mouth close to my ears while you tell me the facts."
The unsuspecting pair did as they were told, and in an instant the cat had them both under her claws. No one could deny that the dispute had been definitely settled. The strong are apt to settle questions to their own advantage. Bear and the Bees. A bear roaming the woods in search of berries happened on a fallen tree in which a swarm of bees had stored their honey. The bear began to nose around the log very carefully to find out if the bees were at home. Just then, one of the swarm came home from the clover field with a load of sweets. Guessing what the bear was after, the bee flew at him, stung him sharply, and then disappeared into the hollow log. The bear lost his temper in an instant and sprang upon the log tooth and claw to destroy the nest. But this only brought out the whole swarm. The poor bear had to take to his heels, and he was able to save himself only by diving into a pool of water. It is wiser to bear a single injury in silence than to provoke 1,000 by flying into a rage. The Fox and the Leopard. A fox and a leopard, resting lazily after a generous dinner, amused themselves by disputing about their good looks. The leopard was very proud of his glossy spotted coat, and made disdainful remarks about the fox, whose appearance he declared was quite ordinary. The fox prided himself on his fine bushy tail with its tip of white, but he was wise enough to see that he could not rival the leopard in looks. Still, he kept up a flow of sarcastic talk just to exercise his wits and to have the fun of disputing. The leopard was about to lose his temper when the fox got up, yawning lazily.
"You may have a very smart coat,"
he said,
"but you would be a great deal better off if you had a little more smartness in your head and less on your ribs, the way I am. That's what I call real beauty."
A fine coat is not always an indication of an attractive mind. The Heron. A heron was walking sedately along the bank of a stream, his eyes on the clear water, and his long neck and pointed bill ready to snap up a likely morsel for his breakfast. The clear water swarmed with fish, but Master Heron was hard to please that morning.
"No small fry for me,"
he said.
"Such scanty fare is not fit for an heron."
Now a fine young perch swam near.
"No, indeed,"
said the heron.
"I wouldn't even trouble to open my beak for anything like that."
As the sun rose, the fish left the shallow water near the shore and swam below into the cool depths toward the middle. The heron saw no more fish, and very glad was he at last to breakfast on a tiny snail. Do not be too hard to suit, or you may have to be content with the worst or with nothing at all. The Cock and the Fox. One bright evening, as the sun was sinking on a glorious world, a wise old cock flew into a tree to roost. Before he composed himself to rest, he flapped his wings 3 times and crowed loudly. But just as he was about to put his head under his wing, his beady eyes caught a flash of red and a glimpse of a long pointed nose, and there, just below him, stood Master Fox.
"Have you heard the wonderful news?"
cried the fox in a very joyful and excited manner.
"What news?"
asked the cock very calmly. But he had a queer, fluttery feeling inside him, for, you know, he was very much afraid of the fox.
"Your family and mine and all other animals have agreed to forget their differences and live in peace and friendship from now on forever. Just think of it. I simply cannot wait to embrace you. Do come down, dear friend, and let us celebrate the joyful event." "How grand,"
said the cock.
"I certainly am delighted at the news."
But he spoke in an absent way, and stretching up on tiptoes, seemed to be looking at something afar off.
"What is it you see?"
asked the fox a little anxiously.
"Why, it looks to me like a couple of dogs coming this way. They must have heard the good news and—"
But the fox did not wait to hear more. Off he started on a run.
"Wait!"
cried the cock.
"Why do you run? The dogs are friends of yours now."
"Yes,"
answered the fox.
"but they might not have heard the news. Besides, I have a very important errand that I had almost forgot about."
The cock smiled as he buried his head in his feathers and went to sleep, for he had succeeded in outwitting a very crafty enemy. The trickster is easily tricked. The Dog in the Manger. A dog, asleep in a manger filled with hay, was awakened by the cattle, which came in tired and hungry from working in the field. But the dog would not let them get near the manger, and snarled and snapped as if it were filled with the best of meats and bones, all for himself. The cattle looked at the dog in disgust.
"How selfish he is,"
said one.
"He cannot eat the hay, and yet he will not let us eat it, who are so hungry for it."
Now the farmer came in. When he saw how the dog was acting, he seized a stick and drove him out of the stable with many a blow for his selfish behavior. Do not grudge others what you cannot enjoy yourself. The Wolf and the Goat. A hungry wolf spied a goat browsing at the top of a steep cliff where he could not possibly get at her.
"That is a very dangerous place for you,"
he called out, pretending to be very anxious about the goat's safety.
"What if you should fall? Please listen to me and come down. Here you can get all you want of the finest, tenderest grass in the country."
The goat looked over the edge of the cliff.
"How very, very anxious you are about me,"
she said,
"and how generous you are with your grass.
But I know you. It's your own appetite you are thinking of, not mine."
An invitation prompted by selfishness is not to be accepted. The Mule. A mule had had a long rest and much good feeding. He was feeling very vigorous indeed, and pranced around loftily, holding his head high.
My father certainly was a full-blooded racer,
He said.
I can feel that distinctly.
Next day he was put into harness again, and that evening he was very downhearted indeed.
I was mistaken.
He said,
My father was an ass after all.
Be sure of your pedigree before you boast of it. The Fox and the Goat. A fox fell into a well, and though it was not very deep, he found that he could not get out again. After he'd been in the well a long time, a thirsty goat came by. The goat thought the fox had gone down to drink, and so he asked if the water was good.
The finest in the whole country,
Said the crafty fox.
Jump in and try it. There is more than enough for both of us.
The thirsty goat immediately jumped in and began to drink. The fox just as quickly jumped on the goat's back and leaped from the tip of the goat's horns out of the well. The foolish goat now saw what a plight he had got into, and begged the fox to help him out. But the fox was already on his way to the woods.
If you had as much sense as you have beard, old fellow,
He said as he ran.
you would have been more cautious about finding a way to get out again before you jumped in.
Look before you leap. The Cat, the Cock, and the Young Mouse. A very young mouse, who had never seen anything of the world, almost came to grief the very first time he ventured out. And this is the story he told his mother about his adventures. I was strolling along very peaceably when, just as I turned the corner into the next yard, I saw two strange creatures. One of them had a very kind and gracious look, but the other was the most fearful monster you can imagine. You should have seen him. On top of his head and in front of his neck hung pieces of raw red meat. He walked about restlessly, tearing up the ground with his toes and beating his arms savagely against his sides. The moment he caught sight of me, he opened his pointed mouth as if to swallow me, and then he let out a piercing roar that frightened me almost to death. Can you guess who it was that our young mouse was trying to describe to his mother? It was nobody but the barnyard cock, and the first one the little mouse had ever seen. If I had not been for that terrible monster, the mouse went on, I should have made the acquaintance of the pretty creature who looked so good and gentle. He had thick, velvety fur, a meek face, and a look that was very modest, though his eyes were bright and shining. As he looked at me, he waved his fine long tail and smiled. I'm sure he was just about to speak to me when the monster I told you about let out a screaming yell, and I ran for my life.
My son,
Said the mother mouse.
that gentle creature you saw was none other than the cat. Under his kindly appearance, he bears a grudge against every one of us, and the other one was nothing but a bird who wouldn't harm you in the least. As for the cat, he eats us. So be thankful, my child, and that you escaped with your life. And as long as you live, never judge people by their looks.
Do not trust alone to outward appearances. The Wolf and the Shepherd. A wolf had been prowling around a flock of sheep for a long time, and the shepherd watched very anxiously to prevent him from carrying off a lamb. But the wolf did not try to do any harm. Instead, he seemed to be helping the shepherd take care of the sheep. At last, the shepherd got so used to seeing the wolf about that he forgot how wicked he could be. One day, he even went so far as to leave his flock in the wolf's care while he went on an errand. But when he came back and saw how many of the flock had been killed and carried off, he knew how foolish to trust a wolf. Once a wolf, always a wolf. The Peacock and the Crane. A peacock, puffed up with vanity, met a crane one day, and to impress him, spread his gorgeous tail in the sun.
Look,
He said,
what have you to compare with this? I'm dressed in all the glory of the rainbow, while your feathers are gray as dust.
The crane spread his broad wings and flew up towards the sun.
Follow me if you can,
He said, but the peacock stood where he was among the birds of the barnyard, while the crane soared in freedom far up into the blue sky. The useful is of much more importance and value than the ornamental. The Farmer and the Cranes. Some cranes saw a farmer plowing a large field. When the work of plowing was done, they patiently watched him sow the seed. It was their feast, they thought. So, as soon as the farmer had finished planting and had gone home, down they flew to the field and began to eat as fast as they could. The farmer, of course, knew the cranes and their ways. He had had experience with such birds before. He soon returned to the field with a sling, but he did not bring any stones with him. He expected to scare the cranes just by swinging the sling in the air and shouting loudly at them. At first, the cranes flew away in great terror, but they soon began to see that none of them ever got hurt. They did not even hear the noise of stones whizzing through the air, and as for words, they would kill nobody. At last, they paid no attention whatever to the farmer. The farmer saw that he would have to take other measures. He wanted to save at least some of his grain. So he loaded his sling with stones and killed several of the cranes. This had the effect the farmer wanted, for from that day the cranes visited his field no more. Bluff and threatening words are of little value with rascals. Bluff is no proof that hard fifths are lacking.
Romeo found Juliet, she would not wait. Pyramus and Thisbe made the same mistake. To prove their love, they went to the extreme. The tragedy of theirs, a midsummer night's dream. For all that I could ever read, could ever hear by tale or history, the course of true love won't walk the tide wide.